Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Devin Terrell, Program Officer for Journalism and Media, here with my colleague Kelly Smits to kick off this event, Fueling the Tiger Cubs, How Southeast Asia's Media is Covering Coal's Last Frontier. Kelly and I run the Journalism and Media programming at the Stanley Center for Peace and Security. And the Stanley Center is a nonprofit organization that partners with people, organizations, and the greater global community to drive policy progress in 3 issue areas: mitigating climate change, avoiding the use of nuclear weapons, and preventing mass violence and atrocities. In our climate-focused journalism and media work, we collaborate with journalism organizations, networks, and other media partners around the world to create and carry out programs like reporting trips and fellowships, journalism training and workshops, and other activities for journalists who are covering climate change and related issues. 2020 has, of course, been a very unusual year and has challenged us and many of our partners to approach our work a little differently. Today, we're here with Climate Tracker, an organization with a mission to support, incentivize, and train young journalists around the world to write great climate stories. With 15,000 members, Climate Tracker is the world's biggest network of young climate journalists. Along with their workshops and training opportunities, they have experience guiding young journalists to analyze their own country's media narratives. Which brings us here. In 2019, the Stanley Center and Climate Tracker had separately carried out in-person workshops and trainings in Southeast Asia for journalists who were covering coal, renewable energy, and energy transition issues. We both knew there was a lot more we could do, and when we realized we were doing similar things, we started thinking about holding some workshops together in 2020. Then the pandemic struck, and in March, at the beginning of lockdown in Asia, Europe, and the United States, Chris in Malaysia and I in the United States were exchanging messages on WhatsApp, trying to make sense of what was happening in the world and what it meant for our work. About 100 incoherent messages later, we started brainstorming this little idea that became Fueling the Tiger Cubs. The heart of the idea was to bring young researchers and other stakeholders in Southeast Asia into a process of investigating how media in their countries are currently covering coal and clean energy issues, to learn where the real gaps, challenges, and opportunities are. You'll hear more about the research process from Climate Tracker in a moment, but first, it's worth explaining why this topic and why Southeast Asia.
According to the International Energy Agency's Coal 2019 report, coal accounts for almost 40% of electricity generation and more than 40% of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions worldwide. Asia's share of global coal power generation climbed to almost 80% in 2019, and much of that increase has come from Southeast Asia, led by Indonesia and Vietnam. At the same time, it is well understood that a shift away from coal and other fossil fuels and toward clean energy to power the countries of Southeast Asia is essential to curbing global climate change and meeting the targets set out in the Paris Agreement. In this context, the ways that journalists and news organizations cover and frame coal and clean energy stories in Southeast Asia play an influential role. Decisions about what to cover, how to cover it, who to use as sources, and how much news attention to give to clean energy themes shapes public and policymaker perceptions about the region's energy future. Focusing on the national and local news sources that most people consume in the region, the goal of this collaboration between the Stanley Center and Climate Tracker was to investigate trends in national media narratives on coal and clean energy within the 5 Tiger Cub economies of Southeast Asia: the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The term is an extension of the original 4 Asian tigers: Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong. Equipped with this evidence, we wanted to be able to share this information with others who can help to improve or shift reporting to better align with climate and energy goals in the region. Along the way, we also wanted to make sure the process of the media research and analysis was inclusive, to bring young journalists and researchers working in the countries of interest into the investigation, and to consult with stakeholders outside of journalism who have an interest in seeing a shift in media narratives.
So Climate Tracker was a perfect partner for these goals. After collaborating to conceptualize the different parts of this program together and pooling our contacts in the region, Climate Tracker took the lead designing the research plan, and then recruiting, training, and guiding the young journalists and researchers who ended up carrying out the research. We then worked closely as each report in the series was drafted and published, and as we planned this event today. We've had more than 150 people register to participate in today's event, including journalists, editors, journalism networks and support organizations, climate and energy advocates, policy and communications professionals, researchers, funders, and journalism students. We also have a fantastic lineup of panelists. And so to give you a sense of what to expect over the next hour and 20 minutes, give you a little overview of the agenda. We're going to start with Climate Tracker sharing some information about the research process and key findings. And then we are going to hear from the lead researchers of this project to share their takeaways from each of the 5 focus countries. Then we're going to move to a panel discussion and question and answer session, followed by a live poll. And then after that, we'll move to the conclusion, and we'll encourage everybody to engage a little bit with the platform in SwapCard to contribute ideas to the discussion threads there. To orient you on the platform, please look at the right of your video, and you should see a box that says chat, questions, and polls. We'll direct you to the poll later in the event, but in the meantime, if you have any questions for Climate Tracker, the researchers, or panelists during the event, you can click the questions button and add your questions. We'll have team members monitoring the chat and the questions, and if we don't have time to answer all of your questions today, we can still respond after the event. Before we hand it over to Climate Tracker for the next segment, I wanted to give a huge thanks to the researchers who've been involved with this project for more than 6 months, and to Climate Tracker for being such an amazing partner. I also want to thank our climate and communications teams at the Stanley Center for their collaboration, and our amazing operations team for all of their help pulling this event together. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to pass it over to Climate Tracker.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Devin and Kelly, for that wonderful introduction. I am one part of the Climate Tracker team that you'll meet, and trust me, I am the lesser of the two. I firstly want to dispute the 100 messages. I think it was more like 107. But my job is to give you an introduction into what we actually did after those messages were all deleted. So we started with a philosophy of any PhD researcher could dive in and do a kind of a data analysis or a media analysis of all the media across a particular country. And that really helps that media researcher, but it doesn't really help the media industry. It doesn't help young journalists in particular who want to understand where they might fit in their kind of media ecosystem. So the way that we approached this project is we began with a training orientation, and we approached with an online course where we had 28 different trainees from across the 5 different countries involved. And that was kind of part training, part selection process. And after that training was done, we ended up with 10 incredible research fellows, 5 of which you're going to meet later in this call. Those research fellows dived into their national media ecosystems, and in our partnership, there was definitely some to and fro in discussing the best possible methodologies in each different country. As you'll hear later on, and as you probably know, the media landscape is incredibly diverse across these 5 countries, and you can't necessarily approach every country in the same way. In the end, though, we ended up looking through, analyzing, coding, and kind of dissecting, if you like, more than 1,700 articles. We did interviews with 99 different journalists, editors across the region. And we did all that over quite a short period of time, which you're surely going to hear about as we go. And hopefully you won't hear too many stressful stories. If you check out the timeline, you will see that we began our journey back in May, June with that competition, as I mentioned. We pushed through July with our training. And then from July until September, we were focused on this kind of media analysis, and that had multiple stages inside of it, with coding, with kind of data collection, with the interview stage and the analysis. We've now been publishing our research over the last month, and tonight is a bit of a presentation of this research, but also a bit of an announcement of our action plan and consultation process that we are continuing for the rest of the month of December, so that we can come up with the best possible roadmap for what we do with this research. This project was never just about finding out what's going on. It was also about thinking about what we might be able to do in this context. And now I'm going to pass it over to Mai to give you an insight into what are some of the ideas that we actually encountered along the way.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Chris. Hello, everyone. My name is Mai Hua, and I am Climate Tracker's Southeast Asia lead. So as Chris mentioned, we are going to have a lot of time today for sort of the thinking ahead and the action plan. But first, I just want to outline the key findings from our research, which are also in the regional report that we sent out. Hopefully, you've had a chance to skim through it. But I'm just going to start talking about the two main sections of our findings. First of all are the thematic findings, and then next are the journalistic practices. So in terms of thematic findings, we've outlined the key reporting trends in these 5 Southeast Asian countries for different energy technologies. In terms of coal, even though Southeast Asia can sometimes be monolithically seen as a place where coal is still king, each of the 5 countries in our research actually diverges a lot in how much they use coal. And what we found is that how positively or negatively the media frames coal is highly dependent on how much coal each country uses. Except Philippines is somewhat of an outlier because coal narratives there are more negative than what we'd expect. And you're gonna hear a little bit more about this from our researchers themselves. In terms of renewable energy, we found that wind presents the largest missed opportunity in reporting in the region. The wind is actually potentially the cheapest renewable source in these 5 countries, yet it doesn't receive much coverage now. You'll hear more from our researchers as to why. And solar is, in fact, the renewable energy that gets the most coverage, but dominantly from a business interest frame. We still don't see a lot of articles that frame it as baseload energy or a more long-term replacement for fossil fuels. But other forms of renewable that are mentioned, namely biomass, biodiesel, and geothermal, all receive rather lukewarm coverage, except for a couple of special cases, like in Thailand for biomass and Indonesia for biofuel, because there's more national interest based on specific government policies. And then in general, big hydro dams are not regarded as renewable energy because big hydro has been around for a longer time in these countries, so it's seen as a more traditional source. But more importantly, in these 5 countries, especially those in the Mekong area, like Thailand and Vietnam, they're really seeing the ecological impacts of hydro. So journalists and editors are saying they don't want to lump hydro in the same category with wind or solar. Okay, moving on to journalistic practices, what we found is most journalists in Southeast Asia frame energy as an economic story, which is represented by the fact that more than 50% of energy stories are listed under the business or econ or money finance category of the respective newspaper's homepage. Hard news articles with one source prevail in all of these countries, and especially business and government sources are overrepresented at the cost of community leaders and members' voices being more empowered. So in short, we're seeing that energy is still not approached as a human impact story, but the reason for which differs a bit from country to country. However, there is some cause for a celebration, if you will. We're starting to see the emergence of more niche and independent news outlets or initiatives across these countries, which are willing to provide space for in-depth and innovative reporting on these topics. And usually these initiatives are headed by journalists who received training or other support on energy and climate and have a specific interest in the topic. Okay, so that's all for me. Now, I'd like to introduce the 10 researchers who were part of our research program in Southeast Asia. All of them have experience as media practitioners, as Chris previously mentioned, and they attended our training on media research before launching into their analysis. We have 5 lead researchers who did a general analysis of energy reporting in their respective countries. Ari from Indonesia, Nguyen from Vietnam, Angelica from the Philippines, Nadia from Malaysia, and Sipachai from Thailand. And we also have 5 case study researchers who are also attending with us today on Swapcard. And these 5 case study researchers looked into more niche topics in their countries. And they are Jason from the Philippines, me from Vietnam, Katasiri and Wirada from Thailand, and Sharika from Indonesia. But each national report has been released in final or draft forms over the last 6 weeks on our and Stanley's websites. And our researchers have also been sharing their findings in various other platforms, including webinars and podcast interviews, which is why this event is predominantly an opportunity for researchers to go beyond explaining their findings and share also what they see are the biggest gaps and opportunities in their countries, which is why you won't hear as much sort of detailed dive into their research, but just the biggest takeaways. And we'll start with Nguyen, who will pick one big gap and one future action point for Vietnam, and she'll pass it on to her colleagues. Hello, Nguyen.
Thank you, Mai. Hello, everyone. I'm Nguyen from Vietnam. So one of the key findings from my research is that because the Vietnamese government offers incentives to solar, it receives a lot of positive coverage in the media, especially from the business perspective. Wind energy, on the other hand, was given quite modest coverage. So energy expert and guest contributor Antti Nguyen, whom I interviewed, explained that the issue lies in less favorable policies that have not been successful in persuading investors to put in their money. This is a story that needs to be dissected in the media as well. And there are really any journalists specializing in energy, but instead business journalists assigned to cover energy. So to increase more inclusive energy coverage, I suggest that stakeholders can, one, provide training for journalists so that they better understand the environmental and social impacts of energy, and two, offer reporting grants, and three, strengthen collaboration between mainstream outlets with local reporters and strangers. Now I would like to pass over to Sipachai.
Hi, my name is Sipachai Kunawong from Thailand. So my key takeaway is that Thai mainstream outlets produce similar contents when it comes to energy reporting, which are largely one-sided. This stems from the traditional newsroom practice. They assign, most of the newsroom assign reporters to cover daily updates at energy ministries and then following up with businesses. In contrast, independent media, such as Green News Agency, highlight more people's stories because of their editorial emphasis on the inclusion of more than one source and context. So as the action plan, as suggested by an editor of the Standard, which is the digital outlets in Thailand, digital tools like podcasts and short form video storytelling can raise the audience interest in energy. So I like to see support for a combination of digital techniques and solution journalism in energy reporting, which can increase the prominence of alternative media narratives about this sector. So next is Ari.
Okay, thank you, Sipachai. I will continue. So hi everybody, I'm Ari Wulandari from Indonesia. So my key finding is one of the key findings, more than half of my sample stories on coal frame this energy source in a positive light, the biggest percentage among the 5 countries studied. This means coal in Indonesia gets more support from the media because it contributes directly to our export economy, as well as our energy mix. It was very rare as well for me to find stories that discuss a coal phase out explicitly. So some examples I suggested are one cross-country mentorship program. So it will give journalists fresh ideas, including angles from mentors. And the second one is access to data such as the locations of coal mines that can allow journalists to investigate more. I think that's all from me, and I would like to pass it over to Nadia.
Thanks so much, Nguyen, Sipacha, and Ari. Hi, everyone. My name is Nadia. I'm the researcher from Malaysia. So the key findings in Malaysia indicate that editors and journalists in Malaysia urge for an increased emphasis on the social and environmental aspects of coal and renewable energy reporting, just to balance out the quite dominant business and financial angle. Some of the action items being proposed is the creation of an online independent database for good practices in energy reporting, and to include resources like, for example, glossaries for complex energy terminologies and the processes that comes with it, etc. And this is all to be maintained by journalists groups and to be accessible to the public and journalists for transparency. Thank you so much. Handing over to Angelica.
Hi everyone, I'm Angelica Yang from the Philippines. So this is one of the key findings that I actually found while doing our media research on coal and renewables reporting in the Philippines. Many news reports actually portrayed coal negatively as they focused on its energy sources and environmental implications, such as being dirty, destructive, and harmful to communities. Few of these, however, explicitly cited climate change as a long-term crisis if the country continued to rely on this energy source. So I currently have 2 action plans that I would like to suggest. So the first is a local energy reporting guidebook written by veteran journalists and editors. So far, the Philippines does not yet have an up-to-date style guide on energy reporting. So having credible reference material written by veteran journalists and editors can greatly help newbies in the beat. This proposed guidebook should also include best practices, as well as well-written energy stories that readers and new journalists can emulate. The second action plan is more encouragement from the newsroom to produce in-depth feature reports. So there's an overwhelming majority of reports, which I found in the media analysis, which featured short news stories. There was a lack of feature stories that were in-depth and critical. So I suggest that editors must actively encourage reporters to seek out stories through their own initiative instead of just relying on daily press releases and statements. Okay, so back to you, Mai.
Thank you so much, Angelica and Ari, Nguyen, Sipacha, and Nadia. So our researchers will now remain in the webinar and Swapcar to listen in on the discussions. And they will be available to answer any of your questions through the chat features during and also after the event. We will gather all the questions in the chat so that every question can be addressed, even if we run out of time today, because I know it's a pretty short event. So next up, we'll hear from 4 panelists who are all working on climate and renewable energy communications, but who did not work on this project specifically. One of our goals for the project has been to bring the report findings to a broader community of journalists, support organizations, newsrooms, climate policy, and clean energy advocates, all of whom are, as Devin previously mentioned, represented in the audience today. And we hope that through the discussions with our panelists who share some of all of these perspectives, we can identify constructive ways to increase and strengthen media coverage that better aligns with climate and clean energy goals in the region. So with that, I would like to introduce the panelists for today. First is Imelda. Imelda Albano is the content coordinator at Internews Earth Journalism Network. Next is Kitty Boo. She is the Global Renewable Energy Lead at the European Climate Foundation. Sven is the editor-in-chief and executive editor of Clean Energy Wire, and Tammy Mayer is the communications manager at Renewable Energy for the 21st Century, or REN21. So welcome again, all of our panelists, and thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being here with us today. How is everyone doing?
Good, thanks for having us.
Yes, of course. So I'm going to outline the panel a little bit before we get started with the questions. We're going to have around 45 minutes for this discussion, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the webinar attendees. But during our 45 minutes, there are three main themes that we will cover. I will first ask you for your reflections on the report that we've shared with you. And then the second part is you talk about the experiences with energy communications, and in some cases also journalism. And then lastly, we will talk about action plans for the future. All right, so I'm going to start with the first general question for everyone. So please feel free to answer in whichever order you want to. But my question is, what was the most interesting or surprising thing that you learned from our regional report on energy coverage in Southeast Asia?
Should I start first?
Yeah,
thanks, Mai.
Sorry, Melda.
Yeah, good evening, or should I say good day, everyone. This is indeed an interesting analysis of the energy-related media coverage, conducted over a period of, is it 3 months? In 5 countries in Southeast Asia. So congratulations to the researchers. And of course, thanks to the Climate Tracker and the Stanley Center for Peace and Security for inviting me to this webinar. Well, if you ask me, I think the mere fact that in all countries, renewables are booming, but coal is still king and framed as the future energy. Coal power plant construction will push ahead in Asia despite falling electricity demand and environmental concerns. Especially now that the policymakers prioritize boosting our economies crippled by the COVID-19 pandemic. So actually, it is not a surprise to see energy stories in an economic development perspective, even at the expense of environment and human impact stories. In terms of media coverage, it is, of course, understandable how limited the reporting were in terms of quality and quantity due to many factors like different levels of understanding coal, energy, renewable, climate change, or environmental issues in general. Even resources to do in-depth stories, space in newspapers or in TV and radio, and other factors which I believe we can touch on as we go on. It is also interesting to know how active the non-government organizations are in educating the communities and the media alike about coal and its impact to the environment, as shown in most of the stories examined, like in the Philippines by Angelica and Jason. And of course, on how the government, on the other hand, has been aggressively promoting their energy mix program or plans to the public.
Thank you, Imelda. Yeah, I think those are a lot of the key findings that stood out to the researchers and myself as well. Okay, I'm gonna pass it on now to Sven. Hi, Sven.
Oh, hi, everybody. Good day from Berlin. It is actually pretty gray day, but anyway, thank you, Devin, Chris, and the whole Climate Tracker team and all the researchers, for giving me the opportunity to look into this study and discuss it with you. But also, first of all, congratulations to a very, very valuable piece of work, a great report. I mean, I have to say, I wish we had something like that as the Clean Energy Wire got started 7 years ago, because we had to rely much more on our instincts than that solid piece of research. So that is a real positive in itself, I think, which you should all value highly, because you can work with that now. Well, as Imelda has referred to, and I can just reiterate what has been said, as there are things in this report that are really surprising, and I'll come to that in a second, but then there are also things that which makes it valuable because they are a reminder of what is really important. And one thing is that we tend to forget that journalism also is a reflection of the public debate. dominated often by the government, by businesses, but sometimes in positive cases also by people on the ground, by NGOs and activists that change the whole discourse. And journalism often is a reflection of that. Sometimes journalists get pointed at as like, oh, you need to change the narrative. Yeah, well, that's part of the story, but we're part of a bigger environment and an ecosystem of communication, and that is really important to have in mind. And the other thing which the report is a reminder of is the fact that in a lot of reporting, if you're just thrown at it or into it as a journalist, getting the context together for your story is really tricky. It's easy to blame someone to not have the context in and all the wider issues, but as Imelda said, sometimes you just lack that background. And I think one of the researchers also described that situation where, a reporter just gets assigned a story and then he calls the same 3 sources because that's what he can do in that short amount of time. So, this whole context, getting the right context in is a really important thing. And it's one of the toughest jobs we all have to get that one right in short amount of times. So these are the 2 things that were not so surprising, but super important about the findings. Now, the positive surprise for me coming from Europe and from Germany was the relatively positive attitude, even if there was not enough coverage of it, towards renewables as an investment, because we spent the last 2 decades explaining here that renewables are not a massive waste of money. Let's put it bluntly. I mean, that was the counter line, for renewables here. It's expensive, it doesn't produce, it doesn't cover the electricity needs. So if you already have a sort of like peg in many of these countries that says, oh, well, actually, it's not that bad of an investment. Well, congratulations, that is a surprise for me and obviously a positive one. But the most surprising thing actually happened in the round after, not in the report, but the action plans that your colleagues were drawing up. And I thought, wow, I mean, yes, tick, yes, tick, yes, tick, let's go there. I mean, there were great ideas, and I've just finished my grand renewal draft for our own project. And I thought like, maybe I should include some of these ideas here for Europe as well, because they're really, I mean, I'm sure we're going to discuss the elements later, but I thought, that is the way to go for it, not just analyze the situation, but come up with, ideas how to make it better. I really have to say, I really like that.
Yeah, I'd like to say a big thank you as well for the researchers for their amazing ideas on the action plan. And also we actually organized a series of national webinars leading up to this one, where we also engaged stakeholders from multiple areas to contribute their ideas as well. So sort of the list of action plans that you just heard is the result of all of that process. But yeah, I think it's really interesting that both Imelda and Sven, you mentioned the fact that renewable energy is reported so positively as one of the more surprising things, because I was sort of getting into this routine of reading all these reports where I got used to renewable being reported so positively, because that's literally what I was seeing across all of these 5 countries and all of the 10 researchers. So for me, hearing the history behind, this is actually not a new trend. It's something that is more recent and more surprising for you coming from an outsider's perspective. That was definitely really interesting. And before we continue with the panel, I just want to highlight, going back to Imelda's comment a little bit, that our research actually looked at coverage from January 2019 to August 2020. The research was done over 3 months, but the time frame was larger than that. Okay, so I can pass it on to Kitty now. I think Kitty comes from a little bit of a different background. She's done a lot of work in reporting, but also currently works for the European Climate Foundation as well. So Kitty, what are the surprising findings that you noticed in the report?
Thanks, Mai Huang. Thanks for the researchers' hard work for putting together such an amazing piece of work. It is really informing and full of positive surprises. But one thing that caught my eye was, the second piece, Mai Huang, you talked about around the journalistic practices. I read through the report, and there were a few things that in the practices listed, from the fact that most of the reports were framed as energy, economic type of story, to how journalists tend to call up a couple of sources that they constantly quote time and again. I feel like that part, what the report is really communicating to me, was the fact that under what kind of conditions our reporters are operating, with what level of help, support, and capacity building opportunities in the region. Because I feel that, a lot of the reporters I've had contact with working for international media, they've had certain exposure, they've covered bigger regions, they have made that sort of cross-examination of different regions, different files, stories, beats, and so on. However, when you have a reporter whose reporting line is to somebody who is also new to climate reporting and energy, then the media structure is built around very old structure of beats that's structured around very traditional topics, right? So when there's an energy story came about, the editor's first thinking is, where does it get placed? Is it a commodity story? If it is not a commodity story, is it a corporate story? Can we chuck it under corporate reporting? If it is not, is it a policy story? Let's chuck it over there. So it's kind of framing new pieces of information, new type of stories, but against an old shoebox, if you know what I mean. We need to fundamentally change the way that editors think and the way we holistically as an ecosystem looking at how these topics need to be reported in order to facilitate an environment that enable reporters interested, keen to do the proper reporting to be able to drive really good results. Now, one example listed in the report is about how in Indonesia, all the reporting, and I see it's a high volume of reporting around the supercritical technology around coal. Now, that in itself is a very easy piece to bust as a myth. If you look into the supercritical technology, is it real? There is something there that's been positioned as clean coal. Is it really clean? And in terms of the application of the technology, pretty soon after you read into it, you'll realize that if you build any coal-fired power plants that's under gigawatt kind of capacity, this clean technology, quote unquote clean technology, cannot simply be displayed, cannot be applied, essentially. And then the next question is, how many of our world's coal plants are going to get built that's over 1 gigawatt or 10 gigawatt from now on? None. So there's a lot of this knowledge and capacity that could really be brought up around the reporting in order to make our sort of newer topic with an old system work, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, thank you so much for your insight, Kitty. I think you brought up an important point there where we not only have to engage with the journalists, but the editors, who are the people actually making the decision of where to file these stories and what type of shoebox is how you phrase it to put them under. It's very important to work with them as well, because often they are the decision makers and not the journalists, some of whom might want to do it differently but struggle to do so. Okay, so last I'm going to bring on Tammy to respond to that question. Tammy also has, I think, a different perspective from this as well, where her works has been more in communications about renewable energy in particular, rather than journalism. So Tammy, what findings stood out to you?
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for sharing the report. I'm really excited about this particular report because it's going to help frame what REN 21 is doing in terms of its communicating in the region. And so the two things that stood out are similar to those that have been mentioned by the panelists already. The first being that these articles tend to focus on the economic argument when talking about renewable energy in particular. And as was previously said, this is a reflection of the larger society's view of renewable energy and what ways our politicians, our business people are thinking about energy and the ways that renewables can play a role both in economic development and in addressing societal concerns and environmental concerns. So this isn't something that's dissimilar to what's happening in other countries, but the emphasis on the economic story as being the primordial story and not anything else is something that we need to build up in our communications efforts. We need to reflect on that, and we need to leverage that so that we're not ignoring it. I think that if we focus entirely on changing the narrative that the journalists are developing, that's important and that's work that we must be doing, but we also need to leverage the messaging that is already out there. And so that's one thing that really caught my eye in reading the report. The second element was also this idea of what pressure. So Kitty just talked about the pressure that the media outlets are under to produce a story and to frame it in a particular way that is consumable by a particular audience, and to get the story out there very quickly, which might mean not having enough sources, not really going into the complexity. And that really reflects a need, not only in journalism, but a need in the broader community to understand the complexity of energy, the production of it, the consumption of it, and how energy can have co-benefits. The different sources of energy and uses of energy need to be discussed more tightly and in parallel rather than broken up and separated into separate stories. And so really diving into that nuance is going to be really important for communicators going forward.
Yeah, I think, Tammy, you brought up a great perspective where it's not necessarily a bad thing that so many of these stories are focusing on the economic lens, but maybe what we can try to do more is more of these stories should also quote from a broader perspective than when they're applying the economic frame, not just going to business and government when they're doing that, right? Because I feel like when they're quoting NGOs, usually NGOs have a message that's more focused on the greater values, the moral values or environmental values that come with a renewable energy transition, but don't speak enough to the economic story that a lot of these journalists are looking for. Yeah. Okay, so I'm now going to transition us a little bit into the next section, which is I would like to hear from everyone here from your previous experiences with energy communications and journalism. I'm gonna switch the order a little bit. So Tammy and Kitty, since you went last time, I'm gonna pass it on to you first. And my first question for you, as part of REN 21 and the European Climate Foundation, you both have a lot of experience communicating global energy trends. So how have your organizations in the past gone about building community about renewable energy? Either Tammy or Kitty can
Kitty,
go
would
first.
You like to? Well, so REN 21's mission is to accelerate the development of renewable energy. And we have our own community with our members. We have 87 growing members. That number is shifting day by day. And the members make up a smaller group of our steering committee, which govern REN 21. So this includes a balanced representation of people from science and academia, industry associations, governments, intergovernmental organizations, and NGOs. And we involve our members in special events and collaborative projects. But we also develop a larger community with people from these stakeholder groups, as well as other stakeholder groups, and try to do that through primarily events and collaborative reporting. So we have our flagship reports, the Renewables Global Status Report and our Renewables in Cities Global Status Report. And both reports are the result of hundreds of contributions and individual peer review volunteer efforts. So bringing people together to build these reports is part of our community building. We also collaborate with other organizations to put together events and articles and videos that both attempt to reach new audiences or explain renewables in a new way that help decision makers better understand the issues that they are confronted with. And so it has a lot to do with these events that we hold and the reports that we generate. And I think it's worth noting that we just finished our big academy event, which brings together people in a somewhat balanced way, really trying to bring together these different stakeholder groups to talk about renewable energy and be frank about how we can overcome barriers and take action. And so that's the best way that we have learned to do it. It's really through these individual connections. Building community in a larger sense is something that we help other organizations do as well. And so developing ways that we can develop a community of communicators and developing real community around the communications. So that is coming up. And so if you're interested in that, we should talk. But that's something that we're developing right now, is that community of communicators around renewable energy.
I see. So in your work so far, what are maybe some of the specific challenges, or have you encountered any specific challenges with communicating these reports and engaging with particularly the media for these reports and these events in the Southeast Asia or the greater Asia Pacific region?
So our reports, our big flagship reports, are global. And we have had some regional reports in the past, and we're really trying to encourage other groups to take on those regional reports. So what I'm going to talk about right now is really those global reports where we focus on finding regional trends. And it's really difficult to develop clear regional trends for Southeast Asia because of the diversity in geographic and socio-political contexts. And so we can develop big trends, but then when we try to apply them to a particular nation or a particular sub-region, that trend no longer applies. So having the time and resources to develop these individual narratives for each country and sub-region is one of the challenges that we face in our report writing. And the second element that's challenging for REN 21 is language. So again, it comes down to time and resources. There are a variety of different languages, and we rely on volunteers to translate our reports, but also notably our press releases. And so that can add a lot of time. Using volunteers can take a week or more to get a particular press release translated. And then adding to that the idea of having that press release be adapted to the narrative of that particular country or subregion adds a certain amount of complexity that we as a small nonprofit aren't really ready to address. So that's definitely, it comes down to time and resources as a small NGO.
I see. Okay, so passing on to you, Kitty, I'm wondering if you've experienced some of the similar challenges as well in your communications work in the Southeast Asia region?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think a lot of, I want to kind of say this as a kind of scene setting. A lot of media pride themselves on being objective, and I think of nothing less about the fact that they should be. In giving sort of the positions for different people sitting on different chairs to be able to have their input and so on. However, I think going back to what I talked about earlier in answer to your first round of questions, I feel like it is really critical that when the time has changed and it's in a different era, that media take a hard stand on issues around climate change. So having said that, it's not asking media no longer be objective in the way they look at certain stories, they organize their file in their way of doing their reporting and so on. However, it is very hard when it comes to climate related issues and certain energy issues not to take a stand on that. So I think what we tend to do is in this community, finding out editors and reporters and people working in a broad sense as actors in the space that think similarly, and is taking a hard stand on certain climate issues and energy issues, and keeping them close as our ally and as our strong advocates. And a lot of what the ECF is able to do is to partner with global organizations such as IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency, in bringing some of the broad global narratives and trends, and sometimes to the country-specific level. However, translating that with our strong voices and advocates in making those global trends and contents into something that's region-specific and country relevant. In the meantime, building a community is not just about finding the like-minded people. It's also about reaching out to the unlike-minded people. And I feel like in the process of doing that, expanding the community becomes a key question. And a lot of what we do is also through various different capacity building, different communications and outreach programs and so on, in getting people to understand what it's like to report on these issues, and most importantly, connecting dots. And broaden their horizon. And like Sven talked about earlier, about giving that context, giving that global flavor, and then a lot of times helping them to break down what is this piece that you care about, and why do you have to care about something different, a different trend that's happening in a different country, a different narrative that's happening in a different region, in connecting the dots to facilitate that process.
Yeah, I think definitely your insight on like not only finding the like-minded people, but reaching out to unlikely stakeholders and sort of framing everything in a way where one trend or a global trend can apply to these specific country narratives, something that's very important. So now I'm going to pass it on to Sven. So Sven, you're someone who has many years of experience as an energy journalist who worked for Reuters and before becoming the editor-in-chief and executive director of the Clean Energy Wire. So what has your experience been like in finding the like-minded people, as well as engaging other stakeholders in building up a very niche but also I guess comprehensive clean energy wire in the context of Germany, but also I know you're broadening your work in other regions as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mike, for those questions. And first of all, let me say that this is such an exciting discussion, and I would almost love to comment on every single thing that has been said so far, because there's so many important elements. But yeah, at the Clean Energy Wire, well, maybe I'll do connect the two things, or three things that have been said. One by you, and one by Kitty actually. Now, this is the when we write about, as journalists, when we cover the issues of the energy transition, when we cover renewable energies, it's so important to keep in mind what are the country-specific elements that need to be addressed. And that is something that cannot be done, with a blueprint from somewhere else. Yes, you can look somewhere else, and you should, but you need to apply it to your own audience, to your own community. And one thing you said is like, whether it's a bad thing or good thing that it's been framed as an economic story very often. Well, I think it's neither nor, as long as we make sure that in this economic story, have the right context, which leads me back to what Kitty said about editors understanding that the energy transition, the whole climate story, is a massive economic story. It is massive, and it needs to be an economic story. So if editors get that, if journalists get that, then you can explain why this is much more than just some environmentalist, sideshow. So I quite interestingly find that, and that is something we try to apply. And that is the other thing Kitty said, in our reporting, and that is something that we try to bring into to our reporting, because it's often missing this cross-beat perspective. Your politics reporter, well, you damn make sure that you know about climate change and climate policy, because it's coming your way sooner or later. Your economics, you're doing societal reporting, justice, environment anyway. So that is really important, and that is a takeaway. And I take that from because I worked as an economics correspondent at Reuters, and I felt that this was, obviously we were the sort of like classic beat reporters, and that was often missing even there. And if you look at what happened during the financial crisis, we missed connecting the dots on that very narrow level of the financial markets. And that's when it hit us all on the head. Now, just imagine, the climate crisis coming our way, and we miss connecting the dots on a much larger scale. So, there I think is one of the key lessons, I would learn, from my work at the Clean Energy Wire. Connecting these dots, creating this context is really essential. And then, look abroad for solutions. The word solutions journalism came up as well. You're not alone there. You don't have to invent everything yourself by far. There are great ideas. So these are a few of the things that I would say we drew from our work at the Clean Energy Wire as positive inspiration to try and make a change bit by bit in the way, this story is covered. We always see ourselves as advocates for good journalism, because at the heart, this is good journalism. If you write about the important things in a factual based, correct way, having the right context, I mean, this should be ideally a good story on everything.
Yeah, talking about looking for solutions, especially solutions from other countries as well. I'm getting a question from the audience about how is coal being reported in European media, especially with a country with a long history of coal like Germany. I think what people tend to forget with sort of Germany's current leadership in renewable is Germany does have a long history of reliance on coal. So yeah, Sven, do you have any insights on potential lessons that can be applied to Southeast Asia, where an energy transition is just starting to take shape in the media narrative?
Well, it links back to what has been said and what I've said before. Well, first of all, you're right. I mean, yes, Germany has built a lot of renewables, but also Germany is still burning and mining a lot of coal. So, people indeed tend to forget that. That's also very important, actually. When you want to do reporting that matters, you have to put your finger in the positives and the negatives of a development, which applies, by the way, also for renewables. I would always suggest not to be, we know that from hydro, that something can be played very positively until, all of a sudden we find out that, maybe we should have had a critical look at some earlier stage as well. What can we learn? Well, the surprising thing about, how coal is covered, when I started in 2014 with the Clean Energy Wire, people were still discussing whether Germany should use the word coal exit, or whether there needs to be some other way of dealing with it, and because the long history and the whole question of how you can take the public along. But and that links to what I said before. You need to have to look at the whole context. We had great researchers, great think tanks, great NGOs, people in the politics and from outside and inside Germany, that bit by bit created a clear picture of the problem and a clear picture of the solution that could help. And media, started to reflect that, because they all of a sudden had competent, and that's really important, competent people, not just people with a headline, but you have NGOs that can go really deep into the economics of coal. You have researchers who can explain to you every single detail of how the sort of detrimental impacts of burning coal could be elsewhere. And so bit by bit, you create a sort of ecosystem that allows journalists, and ultimately to a certain degree forces them, because if they want to do proper reporting, they better speak to the best sources, to get a clear picture of, the pros and cons. And, people are not stupid. I mean, the case for climate action has gotten so overwhelming that many people do realize that they need to look at it more seriously. And then they do.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point about building an ecosystem of different voices that journalists can go to for pros and cons of coal and renewables as well. Because I think we're still seeing that in renewables, journalists are quoting from a very small number of experts in their country. And in Vietnam, I guess it's a little bit of a different case for solar, because Vietnam has had more solar development than these other Southeast Asian countries analyze. So we do see more, I guess, problems being reported. It's less of a rosy story, but then you're still missing the solutions journalism element. That's also very important. Okay, so I want to shift the discussion a little bit with you, Sven, where you mentioned earlier that you were a beat reporter in the economic section, actually, for Reuters. And obviously you made the decision to then become, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but also start and then become the AIC of Clean Energy Wire. So is there hope for Beats reporters to have, I guess, the space and time needed for sort of this, like, connecting the dot work that needs to happen? Or do you think it's, I guess, more realistic to invest in supporting those in more niche and independent media outlets that we highlighted earlier, the smaller number of journalists who are willing to make that decision to maybe go to a smaller outlet where they can do more, in-depth reporting. I wonder what your take on this is.
Well, very important questions and very good ones. And well, two things. First is, I do firmly believe that, for this sort of important cross-speed, cross-country, transnational story, it's a global story with a very strong local angle. You need a different type of journalism that's not driven by, I'm competing with my fellow journalists. I think we should strive for the best story, not necessarily for the one that outdoes, that's faster than the other journalists, which is what I grew up with as Reuters journalists. Our goal was to beat the Bloomberg people and to be faster than AP. And now I think this whole idea of collaborative journalism, of, working together, tapping into your expertise, I think this is essential. And that doesn't matter whether you're a beat journalist somewhere in a conventional media. You can tap into that resource. You can call the Clean Energy Wire and you get, maybe an expert on wind power if you need one. So, making your expertise then also available. If I have a question about Vietnam, who can I call? Can I call a fellow journalist who has my mindset as a journalist? That would be very helpful, obviously. So that's one thing. And the other thing, which I find really important with you, because you mentioned the niche media questions, I do think the other thing that ultimately will have to change, or at least be added, is the way journalism gets funded. Because let's face it, we always blame it on bad journalism being not good editors, not good journalists. But let's face it, a lot of it is economic pressure. And if you don't get the time and the money to do proper research, what are you going to do? So there is a call. I would firmly say that we need a sort of like third pillar to finance journalism. You have the market-based financing of journalism. You have public broadcasters and all that. And I think we need the non-profit sector to take on, especially at these sort of like new developing fields, or the sort of like the lines, where it's not clear who would take on that role. And step in there. Whom am I talking to? Climate Tracker does a brilliant job in just doing so, but I think we just need more of that, more responsibility also. And to be clear, of funding journalism, not a different form of activism. That is, really you be sincere about funding the journalistic method and the journalistic thinking, which will include sometimes a voice you don't like, because that's what journalists do. They sometimes need to tap into people who have a different point of view from yours. So these are the things that I would say as a message. One, to journalists: collaborate, think cross-border, think cross-beat, team up, share your expertise, make it available. And the other one is to people, out there ready to fund that sort of journalism and help to build that in the various places. I think that's really important that both things happen.
Yes, and I think you brought up a really important point as well. In the Philippines, where we're seeing that a lot of young journalists have this quota of like 4 stories a day, because of these financial pressures, it's really challenging for them to take the time to connect the dots, engage further for each of the story. Which brings me to our other panelist, Imelda, who has a tremendous amount of experience with supporting this kind of journalism opportunity for people in Philippines and in Southeast Asia in general, as well as trainings and other activities with Internews and with Earth Journalism Network. So Melda, wondering if you can share some experience with that, particularly in terms of the challenges that have arisen when you're trying to support energy reporting.
Yes, so apart from being a journalist covering environmental related issues in the Philippines, Asia and elsewhere for the past 20 years, and established the Philippine Network of Environmental Journalists 10 years ago. I've also helped train more than 10,000 journalists in the developing countries through the Internews Earth Journalism Network. And we've done pretty much engaging long-term partnership with, of course, the Stanley Center for Peace and Security in supporting journalists through the Climate Change Media Partnership in most of the international climate change conferences, and even with Climate Tracker. What's interesting to note is that we are seeing more and more journalists wanting to strengthen their reporting on climate change, energy, and other environmental related topics by using innovative reporting tools, such as the use of mobile phones or the mojo journalism, especially with the young journalists. And of course, there's the use of drones, mapping, infographics, and simulations in their reporting. I think there must be a continuous training opportunities for journalists in order for them to progress in reporting, networking, especially in building their confidence to report energy or coal issues.
Yeah, so you mentioned before that you've been training more than 10,000 journalists in the developing countries in general. I'm wondering for Southeast Asia in particular, are there differences across the countries that you've tried to engage with? Like, is it more difficult to engage with journalists from some countries, say Vietnam or Thailand, as opposed to other countries? And that was just a random example, but my general question is, do you think that is the case? And also did our research perhaps provide more insight into why that might be?
Of course, there are differences on how journalists from the region report on energy or coal or any environmental topics, if you like. But the thing here is that we are learning the how, the why, what now and what else should be done in order for us to strengthen our reporting. The more you connect and collaborate with other journalists in the region, the more you learn about them, about their countries, and about how we can improve or develop the ability or the style in reporting energy. This research, of course, is another reason for us to jump into a more collaborative effort with our colleagues from, of course, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines in terms of dissecting the media landscape, facing different challenges and opportunities for energy reporting.
And you mentioned earlier that you're starting to see the use of more innovative reporting techniques, such as cell phones or maybe like visualization tools, that type of thing. So I'm wondering, how do you bridge and continue supporting that wave in newer methods with the still rather traditional approach that a lot of these newsrooms, as we've seen, still take when it comes to energy reporting?
Like climate change, energy reporting is a complex topic, of course. It's for most of journalists in the region. And to report effectively on energy or renewables, journalists will need to have a good grasp of mathematics, I guess, and a clear understanding of energy budget for the country or region that we're reporting about. And an added values for that is, of course, the use of mobile journalism or even visualization, mapping in our reporting.
But do you find those like added tools more prevalent in, say, citizen journalists as opposed to people who work for more traditional media sources? Or how do you consciously like try to support journalists bring those newer tools into older and more traditional spaces? That's my question.
Yeah, I think it's both. We're seeing a lot of citizen journalists, of course, are using those kind of innovative tools, and more so with journalists in the region, especially in the Philippines.
I see. Okay, so before we transition into the last part, which is the action plan for the future, I have one last general question for everyone in the panel, which is from your own observation, and this doesn't have to be, with Southeast Asian media in particular, but within your own observation of the media that you do consume, has there been any changes in climate and energy coverage in the past few years? And are there more positive or more worrying signs? And I guess this question is also broader than just our research findings, but yeah, what you have personally noticed. I think anyone can answer this first, and feel free to have like a discussion and respond to each other as well, whenever you want to do that.
I'll jump in just really quickly to say that I've noticed a number of journalists who are dedicated to climate and energy issues. And I really appreciate seeing these individuals build their own personal platforms outside of their paid work and even create careers that are outside of the traditional media landscape to reach greater audiences, but also to push the topics a little bit further and to do more in-depth coverage. So I'm really excited to see that development over the last couple of years.
Yeah, wonderful response, Tammy. How about you, Kitty? What do you think?
I think from what I've seen, and unfortunately, this is not a very positive sort of thought. I apologize for that. But
balancing it out.
Yes, Glenn talked about earlier really registered with me, which was the fact that, the media outlets are under extreme economic pressure. We've seen this in the last few years now. One extreme case I can name was that pre-COVID times, I went to Pakistan, and then the local editors network was telling me how in 2016, the country has seen close to 10,000 media outlets. And then 3 years later, that number went to close to 3,000. So 2/3 of media outlets vanished. And we've seen that in the US, we've seen it pretty much everywhere. So when media is under such extreme pressure to make ends meet, they will have to, undoubtedly look for resources. And we've seen a lot of corporate sponsored content coming into play. And I think that just kind of exposes the vulnerability of media in this tough climate, media business, that I've seen this served as a good opportunity or a window for certain people to inject false narratives and in some ways myths around renewable energy, misconcept around coal. So that's one thing I've picked up every once in a while in the media, and you see through, the meticulous media monitoring, what is popping up where and what is saying what narrative. And you can sort of, with the local context, imagine or analyze why a certain trend or a narrative is certainly popping up in this region at this moment. So that I would say is a certain worrisome trend. But I think also collectively as a community and all the panelists on this panel, what I think we could walk away thinking about is that, energy transition is such a huge topic. In my mind, I'm not entirely clear on how reporters report on this. I'll be the first to admit that. I think a lot of us are learning. All of us are still learning that nobody has really developed an extensive dictionary or a set of textbooks, even for ourselves. So how do we go about something that's like a vast sea of knowledge and 1,000 different framing and 10,000 different ways of looking at different stories, and is evolving on a day-to-day basis? That I think is something that I will take away from this and then continue thinking about.
Yeah, I think, Kitty, your comment about sort of the media conversions that's happening and what it means in terms of more advertorials and PR content and these myths popping up in places, that really resonated with me. It's definitely when we looked at these news outlets in the 5 countries, especially in Indonesia, where we're seeing that actually a lot of the media conglomerates that publish these stories also have subsidiaries that have stakes in coal mining. It's really easy to see the myths about, like you mentioned before, ultra supercritical technology and clean coal and all of that popping up. And usually we don't for an average reader, it might not be clear that that's a PR content piece because it's framed as just a normal news article. So that is certainly a very worrisome trend. And hopefully in the next part, we can talk more about potential action plans and solutions to the trend. But yes, now I want to pass on to Imelda for some observations and changes that you've seen in the media recently.
Yeah, and apart from what you have mentioned, we have to admit that climate change or energy stories have to compete with political and sensational crime and corruption stories that take top news priority. That is true not just in the Philippines but throughout Asia. So we have to really find ways to make climate change and energy stories sexy and bring down the science to a level that can be easily explained to the common people. Most of the reports were focused on the style where journalists are comfortable in doing so. While there are energy beat reporters, for instance, in Metro Manila, most journalists in the countryside are general reporters or correspondents and not receiving much training, I guess, in energy reporting. While reports increased significantly in the past few years, I would not say that there is poor coverage, although environmental advocates would probably look forward to a time when climate change or energy becomes a regular fare in our newspapers or broadcast news, the way there are regular sections for sports or for showbiz. So we are seeing a fundamental shift in the newsworthiness of climate change and energy coverage in most parts of Asia, and at least in the Philippines, for a country literally at the doorstep of typhoons and natural disasters. And it's a low-lying archipelago of more than 1 million people. It's a perfect laboratory of stories to humanize the impact of climate change and energy, and and highlight energy options.
Yeah, I think certainly those aspects that you mentioned, Imelda, in the Philippines could have contributed to the fact that in our analysis, we found that there were more coal stories that brought in all of these other aspects and climate change and their impacts in the Philippines, as opposed to other countries where the coal narrative is more reminiscent of how dependent that country is on coal. Okay, so lastly, bring it to Sven. What are the changes that you have noticed recently?
Well, I just want to quote Charles Dickens on this one. It's the best of times and it's the worst of times. I think it's the entry line to Tales of Two Cities. I think we are seeing some really, really interesting projects and on energy transition reporting and on climate change reporting. We have seen, a lot of engagement, and I would say, at least in Europe, across the board, the recognition that this is a major topic, that now stretches across many, many media. Having said that, the risk is that, a lot of it is done, again, as a sort of specialized niche reporting, where you are a labeled climate reporter or you are a labeled energy transition reporter, whereas your business colleague who writes the everyday coverage still covers it the way he or she did it before. So, and we see that as well. And then we also see the emergence. I mean, once you get that sort of niche that is the sort of like, climate and energy transition reporting niche, you get the counter niche, if you want, which relates to what Kitty said and then Imelda as well about this sort of the questions, who is actually the source of information in a public debate? Is it really the mainstream media, as we call it? Is it really the journalist, or haven't we lost large part of our gatekeeper role to all sorts of people, in a positive way sometimes. If it's an influencer, I think Tammy mentioned that actually it can be someone who's taking the baton and creates his or her own blog, and that's fantastic. But the same way that can be done and is done in very aggressive ways that are harmful to many causes, actually, not just the question of climate action. So what have I witnessed? I've witnessed both great new reporting, a general recognition that this is an important story. We're still not there. We're still not connecting the dots. But at the same time, I'm still not sure where this whole new world of digital communication will leave us. And I think we need some really creative thinking of getting the quality information into the debate that will fix the problems and deliver the solutions, rather than confusing everybody in the noise that surrounds us now. And unfortunately, I don't have the perfect answer for that, but it's an observation. I think that's one of the things I'm really looking forward to, all the ideas from the action plans. I hope there's some to tackle that particular one as well.
Okay, so now that we're stepping into the whole new world that you mentioned, Sven, I'm wondering, as you all have different stakes in energy reporting in the region, now that we've completed the research, do you have any ideas of your own maybe that relate to what are the action plans that we could take in the future? And these might align with, the action points that we've already heard from the researchers as well. Sven, you want to take that on?
I'll just start and then I'll leave it quickly to others, because I've heard two things that I really, that Imelda mentioned that, but also some of your researchers, that is this whole idea, connect to people, to journalists across the region, ideally across the globe, but at least start in your environment, and then team up, share your expertise, make yourself available. I think that can raise the quality already a big step, because that can broaden your source base, and don't see it as a zero-sum game where if you write a good story, my story is automatically less worth. No, I think it should be the other way around. It should be, if you write a good story based on something I could help you with, maybe next time it's my story that gains from that experience. So that is something that if you can create an ecosystem, an infrastructure that allows that exchange. I mean, Imelda has mentioned there are already networks in place, but broaden that and work on that to broaden that. I think that is really important. And the other thing, and again, brings me back to the action plan, make people aware that journalism as a quality, how do you say that, a signal for quality of information is really vital for public debates, and it needs support, and it needs people who get paid for doing their job, and that doesn't happen. That just doesn't happen. It's not just raining money because people are doing a good job. You need either paying customers, or you need donations, or you need grant funders, to make that possible. Otherwise, you'll get ultimately people who just have money and pursue whatever cause they have. So, that is the other thing. I don't know what exactly the action plan here is, other than, motivating people with funds to support proper journalism in what they do. But, I think that's really important.
Imelda, any last words on the action plan, maybe as it relates to how funds can be used to support the journalists in the region?
Yeah, I agree with Sven, and I wish to see more framing, I think, on reporting in terms of impact to the environment, as well as discussion on the inclusion of marginalized sectors. That's the women, elderly, the youth, the children, and of course the indigenous peoples. In the stories, especially highlighting, for instance, small projects like mini hydros. I think that is one way of humanizing a complex and highly technical topic such as energy. I'd like to go back again on what we've done, or we are doing at Internews Earth Journalism Network. We help establish networks of environmental journalists in developing countries, including most in Southeast Asia, and build their capacity through workshops, trainings, development of training materials, and offering fellowship programs or grants to media and individual journalists. And of course, to support story production and distribution. Looking at this report, I think we need to see more space allotted to climate or energy reports. We need backing from the editors. A training of trainers might help in order for journalists and editors alike to increase their knowledge and strengthen reporting. and looking more on training on exploring the environmental angles and humanizing the stories by including the what I've mentioned, the marginalized sectors. And of course, mentoring also helps, as I mentioned previously. We need to help boost the capacity of media organizations or networks like with these 5 countries, the Philippine Network of Environmental Journalists, the Vietnam Forum for Environmental Journalists, the Society of Indonesian Environmental Journalists, Thai Society of Environmental Journalists, if I'm correct, and of course, the Malaysian Forum of Environmental Journalists.
All right, thank you so much, Imelda. We have maybe 2 minutes left. Tammy and Kitty, any last thoughts on the action plan?
I think having more capacity building is fantastic. If there's any way that REN 21's experts, a community of experts, but also the people on staff can support journalism and support people writing articles about energy, whether they be community media outlets or traditional media outlets, we'd be happy to support that and develop resources for good journalism around energy, renewable energy.
All right, thank you, Tammy. How about you, Kitty?
I want to say as a last note that, focusing on economic stories and that framing isn't the problem. The problem is not doing that properly. There's so much to dig into around that front in thinking of energy, not as a community, but as not thinking of energy as a commodity, but more as a service. In thinking about the jobs that we can create and not only thinking simply on the supply side, in thinking about energy beyond only the power sector and into multiple sectors and the business opportunities that could innovate and generate around decarbonization to reach the 1.5-degree goal under the Paris Agreement.
Okay, thank you for those closing remarks, Kitty. And thank you once again to all of our guest panelists today, Imelda, Sven, Tammy, and Kitty. I'm now realizing that you can't join the live polling right now unless you exit Zoom and go to Swapcard. But we'd love to have your input in that as well, because it relates a lot to the action plan. And with that, I'm going to transition to the next part. So for everyone attending the webinar, we've heard a lot of discussion and presentation now. So next up, we're going to have a more interactive section, the polling. So in the chat box to the right of the video, you can click on the polls tab. It may take a moment to appear, but once it does, please read the question. We want to know what you personally think would be some of the best ways to support journalists covering energy issues in Southeast Asia. And you can select up to 3 different options. And if you have an idea that's not on the list, please select something else and type your idea in the chat. Okay, so now we're going to leave around 1 minute for everyone to complete the poll before we go into the section with closing remarks. Okay, so we maybe have 30 seconds left for everyone to fill in the polls. I know there are quite a lot of options out there for you to choose, and might be hard to choose the top, 3 action points that you think would be the most helpful. But this is just, a rough polling to see what is the general sentiment among the webinar attendees. So just fill in whatever comes to mind first. I think we maybe have like 15 more seconds for the polling. I almost wish that the polling also displays, I guess, breakdown by the options chosen for people from different backgrounds as well. Like, I'm curious to see, how do journalists respond to this question versus how do editors or how do people from NGOs might respond to this question differently. But it looks like the results are streaming in. So growing alternative news sites featuring skilled energy journalists was, I think, the top response. And it's really interesting. Yeah, I think that really speaks to a trend that we're starting to see in these countries where these sites feature in-depth content but need more funding support and also support to build their audience via multimedia platforms. And then collaboration between urban and community-based energy environment reporters. Oh, I think that's now the top response. This is truly interesting to see the different responses coming to the top. All right, so I think we now have surpassed the allotted amount of time for the polling during this webinar, but I would also like to flag that the poll or a different version of the same poll questions will still be up for after the webinar concludes. So if you haven't had a chance to fill it out yet, you can do so later. All right, so yeah. If you have filled out a poll, but you want to continue the conversation or explain your reasoning behind your choice, you can also do it in the discussion space on the event site. You can click the join a discussion button on top of the page, share your ideas, and thereby inform our regional action plan. And again, like the poll, the space will be open for a couple of days, more specifically until December 5th. So really hope that we'll get some lively discussions going on, and you can also share this with people who weren't able to make it to the live webinar as well. All right, so now I am going to pass it back to Devin for closing remarks. I know we have sort of surpassed the 8:30 or the 1 hour and 30 minute mark a little bit, so I'm not going to take up more time.
Thanks, Mai. Yeah, so we've come to the end of our event, but remember, you can continue to engage with the discussion threads in SwapCard after the video ends, and actually for the rest of this week. So we'll be spending the next couple of weeks working with Climate Tracker to develop the regional action plan and taking in the input shared at this event and in previous discussions from the national reports. We welcome your thoughts on actions and next steps until we close out those discussion threads on December 5th. As a reminder, the finalized regional report will be published here in SwapCard this Wednesday, December 2nd, and on both Climate Tracker and Stanley Center's websites. Want to thank you again to our panelists who are amazing, the researchers, thank you so much for all of your hard work on this. And to everyone who has been involved with this project since it was a crazy conversation on WhatsApp. Thanks to everyone who joined this event or who is watching the recording online after. And that's all for today. Thank you and take care, everyone. We'll see you soon.